Hello, AP World History. Welcome to our last installment of Chapter 38 of our Traditions and Encounters textbook lecture notes. This chapter is called World Without Borders, and we'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. This might end up coming in two parts. I'm not sure how long this will take for me to get through this segment. This really begins, well, let's take a look at this picture here. We can see that Russia is just a massive area, and the I don't know, I guess you'd call it salmon color area is Russia and components of the former Soviet Union. The purple show the former communist-controlled states. Now, how did this happen? Of course, we had a bipolar world with the US being one pole and the Soviets being the other, really as a result of the end of World War II and how things were divided as far as the rebuilding of the world after that major conflict. Many of the Soviet-backed governments that were in the eastern part of Europe lacked legitimacy for the Europeans that lived there. So a series of revolutions occurred throughout the Eastern Bloc, what we call the Eastern Bloc nations. And most of these, many of them, were nonviolent. I remember some of them really, really well. Poland, they had a movement called Solidarity. There's a man named Lech Walesa, and I remember seeing him on TV, and this group was actually outlawed by the Soviets, but they continued to work together in solidarity and won the right to elections in 1989 and 1990. And they were among the first of the former Soviet bloc nations to withdraw from the Soviet Union. Bulgaria and Hungary were right on the heels of Poland and claimed their independence in 1989 to 1990. Now, Czechoslovakia had what they called a velvet revolution. They called it velvet because, you know, velvet is soft and you like to touch it and it doesn't hurt you. And they called it this because there was no violence involved in the Czechoslovakian revolution at first. But then a velvet divorce occurred um, because of differences in a time frame for shifting from a communist to a market economy. And this would divide Czechoslovakia into two regions, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is what they are to this day. Now, the wall was torn down in Berlin on November 9th, 1989. By all accounts, this was a very dramatic event because Checkpoint Charlie was the place where people used to get shot if they tried to cross from east to west, which is what usually occurred. It wasn't very often that someone would try to cross from west to east, usually east to west. And at first, people were hesitant. They didn't even believe, could this really be happening? Could the Berlin Wall really be coming down? And I remember hearing about this as a young adult and being just so excited to see that this symbol of the Cold War was finally coming down, and people were literally rushing into one another's arms. Families were reunited that hadn't been together for many years. And so for many of us, that event was symbolic of the coming demise of the Soviet Union. Germany then was reunited, East and West Germany. It took some negotiations. According to one of my German friends, there still are some issues and some fallout from the fact that the East and the West were divided for so many years, but nevertheless, it is a unified Germany as of 1990. Now, the Soviet Union, as it collapses, as many of the former Soviet satellite states become independent, Russia, the Russian Federation, remains under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. He came to power in 1985, and he would see many of the nations that we just talked about um, separate from the USSR. He became engaged in reform as the necessity for reform became very evident to him because of the economic difficulties that they were having. Really, they spent so much of their money towards the towards the space race and the technology race that many of their internal problems were overlooked, such as the agricultural problems. He promoted perestroika. That's a word that you need to remember. Perestroika, restructuring and decentralization. It was pretty exciting when he came onto the scene because for the first time we heard about Russia, what was going on in Russia. And so Glasnost was also this idea promoted by Mikhail Gorbachev that yes, we can speak publicly, we can admit past mistakes, we can criticize our government and actions that it's taken. And so both Perestroika and Glasnost would lead to a huge change in the Russian Federation, in the Soviet Union, and However, industry and agriculture would continue their decline. People were starving, yields were low, and by 1991, 12 more republics proclaimed independence from the Soviet Union. On December 25th, 1991, the USSR, as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, officially ended, and the flag was flown for the last time. It ceased to exist, which was just amazing and unbelievable to think that could ever happen. Now, the Russian Federation continued, and a coup was attempted of Mikhail Gorbachev by people who disagreed with his reforms, but Boris Yeltsin managed to stave off that coup and was elected Prime Minister of Russia and would continue the process of reform in Russia. Now let's talk about globalization. So the Cold War has ended and globalization has come. The post-Cold War global economy was facilitated by rapid communication and technology and its development. If you think of the fact that when I went to high school, and even college, I typed my papers on a typewriter in college in the early 80s. In fact, an electric typewriter was really a pretty big deal, and I had to put quarters in a slot in order to do that. I remember when my husband first told me that there would be computers that would be able to talk to each other in the same building. This was in the mid 1980s when he worked for IBM. And now look at where we are. Not only has communication and technology led to a global economy, it has also led to vast cross-cultural exchange. Now, we'll be taking a look in these next few slides at global problems that have occurred, inequities that continue to exist, diseases that, because of our global economy and because of the fact that we have so much interchange, continue to threaten our health, terrorism, and feminism. Let's start with economic globalization. One of the first things to really come out of the post-Cold War economy was this idea of reduction and removal of trade barriers. And really global trade was the driving force behind this. The International Monetary Fund was set up to expand free trade and allow for a place where companies could invest and borrow money from in order to build and promote free trade. Some other organizations and agreements occurred. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was agreed on by 23 organizations, non-communist organizations, and the World Trade Organization replaced that in 1995. This would promote unrestricted global trade, and about 97% of global trade falls under the World Trade Organization's guidelines. So world trades exceeded $6 trillion rather by 1990, and is certainly much higher than that by now. Now here you see this. I love this picture because you have the WTO right here. Okay, and that's the World Trade Organization. Up here you have the symbols of many companies. Now I recognize a few of them, of course, IBM, McDonald's, some of the other ones you might recognize, Kodak, I think, is that Microsoft? I'm not positive. But at any rate, the World Trade Organization, you can see, has roots. That's what these are. This is like a massive plant, and it has roots in all of these countries of the world. As these global corporations expand, the world becomes a single market. Now, of course, it doesn't play out the same in every single country, but basically the world is one giant market. Companies like IBM, like Shell Motor, like McDonald's, like Kmart, Walmart, whatever, will search for the lowest operating costs. And so what they'll do oftentimes is they'll have a headquarters, say here in the Twin Cities, we have General Mills and we have Cargill, and we'll keep our some offices in this area, but we will decentralize and have offices all around the world, and as well as extracting resources from around the world. For example, rubber coming from West Africa by, I just forgot the name of the tire company. Oh, well, it'll come to me when I'm all done with this. The implications here are for the exploitation of human and natural resources. And in some parts of the world, like I said, rubber here in West Africa, Firestone, I think is the company, rubber is extracted at the expense of child labor. And some of it really there needs to be more accountability to global corporations for holding their companies to high standards in all parts of the world, not just in the West. Um, Now, economic growth in Asia. Um, Remember in the Marshall Plan for rebuilding Japan and Europe after the war, um, the really important point here is that Japan had limits on military spending. They could not remilitarize. In fact, they are just getting to a point now, I believe 80 years after the war ended, which is coming up next year, where they might remilitarize. But because they did not need to spend money on military, because the US was aiding in their military, they were able to really focus their growth on their economy. So they had major economic growth. They produced many consumer goods. And then the growth of the little tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea, occurred as well as they were able to get into export-driven economies with very low wages for their laborers. And even to this day, low wages in these countries are a problem, not in South Korea so much as the other countries. In China, reforms in the late 1970s, and especially as we move into the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, led to a socialist market economy that we already talked about in the 1990s. And having been to China recently, I can honestly say that there is so much free market economy going on in China. They have collectivization still, and they don't have a lot of private ownership of property, but they are able to freely trade their goods with Westerners. And have a lot of independence in the decision making the companies there do. So big pool of cheap labor helps the growth. I almost feel guilty sometimes when I think of, I bought a quilt once that was like $25 made in China, and I thought, gosh, this is like hand sewn quilt. And whoever made that quilt did not get paid very much money for it. And so if that's something that you feel morally opposed to, you should really think about where you get your clothing and other consumer goods from. New economies were fragile, though. A crisis in 1997 that began in Thailand traveled all through Asia and into the Americas. And in 1998, even we had kind of our own little mini economic crash. And I remember this well because I was actually taking a class on human geography in 1998, and we talked about this very problem, how certain markets had become inflated and then crashed. And so this happens when we overinflate the values of our land and of our goods. Trading blocks. The European Union was one of the trading blocks that came out of this time period, and this was formed in 1957 as the European Economic Community. Now, it became the EU in 1993 and now has 27 members. The EU also created, oops, going to go back one, created the euro, which would replace the multiple currencies that were in all over Western Europe. When my husband and I were in Europe in 1989, we traveled through many of these countries. In fact, all of these that I'm pointing to, we didn't get down to Spain, but they all had different currencies, and we had to get different currencies to travel into these countries. And it was really quite confusing and difficult to keep track of all the currencies. Trading blocks also occurred. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. No, OPEC is very powerful because they control one of the world's most important and uh, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, it's just a very important natural resource, oil. Okay, and so basically they are a group of people that dictate global price of oil. So both their economic and political policies will dictate the price of oil, and we see that from time to time. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations also is a trading bloc, and the goal of the ASEAN is to promote economic growth and political stability in the region, and NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. So I think with that, I'm going to call this one a wrap, and we'll do part 2. Thank you, and have your eyes open for part 2.